Hello, my name is Antony Jinman, and thank you for joining me for my online talk about my expeditions in the geographic North Pole. A decade ago today, I reached the North Pole with my two teammates on Earth Day, and it's a pleasure to be able to share with you kind of my reflections on that expedition and my thoughts on kind of like how the world has changed since then, and crucially what my hopes are for the future as well, because with the virus outbreak and with a lot of us working in isolation, then just what my hopes are for the future world as well. So without further ado, I'm going to go straight into my presentation. So I'm just going to first of all share my screen so we can get this up and running with you. So here we go. So this photograph was actually taken on my birthday, the 8th of April 2010. And ever since I can remember being in primary school, I always had a fascination with the Arctic and Antarctica. And I think that was through learning about Captain Robert Falcon Scott, who was another explorer from the city I grew up in, Plymouth. And I suppose seeing and learning at quite a young age about this frozen world, both in the Arctic and Antarctica, and the animals and the wildlife that live in this very alien world compared to, rural Devon. I just had to see it and experience it for myself. I went into secondary education, and for me, normal secondary school experience was not for me. I did okay at my GCSEs, but I failed my A levels. It wasn't until I was 21 I found out that I'm dyslexic, and I really struggled with reading and writing for many years, and struggled with exams. So I left formal education without going to university and with limited career prospects. So I joined the armed forces, and I'd previously been in the Air Cadets and in the Territorial Army. So I joined the Navy, and I really enjoyed my time in the TA and the Air Cadets. So the Navy I was really looking forward to, because if Captain Scott, who was also Royal Navy, went to Antarctica, then could the Royal Navy take me to Antarctica? Unfortunately, I didn't get on too well with being on board ship. I suffered from depression, and I received a medical discharge just a few years into my career without going down to Antarctica. So then I was left with the dilemma of, what am I going to do now? And so I pursued a career almost accidentally in adventure tourism, but found something that I was really passionate in. I was being paid to take people on adventure holidays. And I started off working in northern Sweden at the Ice Hotel, went on to do work in Africa, the Serengeti, even Iran, doing cultural trips around some of the historic sites in the Middle East. And I really then fell in love with learning through travel. Yeah, and learning doesn't stop purely because you go home at the end of the day from school, or you leave formal education. We're always learning, and there's always something out there to experience and to learn from. So for me, travel, adventure travel, and specifically expeditions have always give you such a rich experience of life. And so I went from adventure travel then into expedition leading, and over 3 years, well, no more than that, probably 4 years of expedition leading, I built up the confidence and the experience to go on a North Pole expedition. So this is what it was like. This is what happens, and this is what I learned from the experience. So the 8th of April would have been nearer the end of the expedition, but you can see that very cold temperatures. And of course, we're traveling over an actual ocean, the Arctic Ocean. So the North Pole is at the bottom of the seabed. And that sea, the Arctic Ocean, is surrounded by land mass. Whereas the South Pole, Antarctica, is a continent surrounded by an ocean. So the two are very, very different for A, getting to, and B, traveling around on as well. So our start point on the North Pole expedition was actually where the red marker is at the top of the Canadian territory. So a place called Ellesmere Island. And it's a very remote part of the world. So the closest settlement to that red marker is a place called Resolute Bay, where we started packing all of our equipment to then fly up to the red marker, which took 5 hours by plane. I'll show you some images of that a little bit later on. So that's sea ice. This is a video of how that sea ice kind of extends and retreats throughout the course of the year. So in the summer months, it's actually it kind of retreats quite significantly, and then expands again in the wintertime. So we started the expedition at the beginning of March, and of course we had to get to the pole before the sea ice deteriorated to the point where we couldn't actually travel across the sea ice anymore. So we had to get there before the end of April. So we boarded a little aircraft, a Basler aircraft, and we flew over Ellesmere Island. We landed after a 5-hour flight here on the sea ice, and it was incredible. The sun was very low to the horizon at the beginning of March, end of February. In fact, it's only just coming above the horizon. And so that sun gives our planet Earth, heat, and without the sun's energy and light, then of course there wouldn't be plant life, there wouldn't be any life at all on our planet. And when the sun is that low, you really get a feel for the temperature and how, extreme this environment can be. And so we started our journey skiing and snowshoeing. You'll see in that photograph as well, snowshoeing across this frozen ocean that we suddenly were very aware of is actually is very dynamic. It moves, which is incredible as well. So the sea ice, it can collide together and break apart, and it moves in front of you. So we're very aware of that. This is probably, this is without a shadow of a doubt one of the hardest things I've ever done. And you really get the quite quickly the impression that you're living in a very narrow margin of safety. So this was our very first night pitching the tent and going inside the tent for our first night's sleep. So if you can imagine the feeling of being there, I was probably extremely excited. Only around 200 people have ever done this. So just to have raised the money to be finally on the sea ice was amazing. I was also quite apprehensive and a little bit worried about what was going to happen. I trained on sea ice before, but I hadn't been this remote before. And I was with 2 teammates, and I was very conscious that I didn't want to let my teammates down. That was a big thing in my mind. We'd spent all of this money getting there. I didn't really know my teammates very well, which caused its own problems in the group as the expedition progressed. So I've learned that actually picking your team and how you can communicate to one another is really, really important. But at this moment in time, I didn't want to let my teammates down. I didn't want to be the reason that this expedition could fail, and we would get extracted off the ice, and that would be it. So that would not be me. I wanted to achieve this, and I didn't want to let my teammates down. So going inside this tent, this was the first night. So there's me unpacking my stuff, getting ready to go inside the tent. And the temperature inside the tent was as cold as the temperature outside of the tent. So the thermometer is showing us it's currently minus 40 degrees centigrade. So, twice as cold as your freezer at home. Incredible, incredible. And that was our very first night. So first night in the ice, you're actually sleeping in 3 layers of sleeping bags. One's a vapor barrier bag, which reduces the amount of moisture that wicks into your sleeping bag as you're sleeping. And then you have a down sleeping bag and then a synthetic sleeping bag on top of that. And the idea is that any moisture that does get through the vapor barrier will actually freeze inside the synthetic bag, but the down sleeping bag will keep you warm and will be free of ice. So our very first night sleeping, getting up in the morning, having breakfast, collapsing the tent, and on we go. So the journey, it's not flat. I've talked about being aware that ice is moving. Well, it forms almost this labyrinth of sea ice that we have to safely navigate our way around and up and over. So it forms these big, what's called pressure ridges of ice. And it's a really dynamic seascape to be traveling through. You can see that we're pulling our pulks, our sledges behind, and that's with all of our food and fuel for the first 3 weeks. And then we actually got a parachute resupply on the ice to then carry on going again. And we actually had 2 parachute resupplies on this expedition. So this is what we call a pressure ridge. We actually went to bed one night, and this was on quite young first year ice. And when we woke up in the morning, that first year ice moves around an awful lot on the ocean. And you also have like multi-year ice, which tends to be piled up next to kind of Canada and Greenland, and that doesn't melt in the summer. So scientists are a bit concerned at the rate in which the multi-year ice is vanishing, and we have quite a lot of young first year ice. So it's the multi-year ice which is disappearing, and that's an indication of how the temperatures are changing in the summer months especially, and getting rid of that multi-year ice. So here, some of that first year ice is actually collided together, and we woke up in the morning, got outside the tent, and there hadn't been a pressure ridge there the night before, and suddenly now there's a pressure ridge. And as I was stood there next to these blocks of ice, you can see and watch these blocks of ice actually moving and gradually creeping towards you. And it's beautiful to see. You can see Mother Nature, in that instance. And it was incredible. And it squeaks and it groans and it pops, and it's fantastic to hear. Fantastic to hear. So the question here is that, not only does the sea ice collide together, but it breaks apart as well. And so our challenge on this minus 30 centigrade day is, how do we get across this channel of open water to the other side of the ice? So this crack in the ice, this is what we call a lead of ice. And so there's a couple of things that we can observe which will help us make our decision. So you can see that close to the horizon at the back there's almost these cigar-shaped clouds. And what's happening is the water is about nearly minus 2 centigrade, and it's warmer than the air temperature. So you get this like cigar-shaped clouds form over the sections of open water. So if you avoid the cigar-shaped clouds, you can actually avoid open water to continue your journey. You can also, if you ski towards those pressure ridges, then actually what's happening is the ice is colliding together there. So if you ski towards the pressure ridges, then you'll be able to ski up and over, hopefully. Whereas if on the right-hand side of this photograph, there's no pressure ridge. So what's happening is it's breaking apart there. So ski towards a pressure ridge, and you should be able to get up and over or find a way over. But there are times when these cracks go on for as far as the eye can see, and you don't know what's around the corner. So you might then have to get dressed in your swimsuit and swim across small sections of open water. And this is quite a harrowing experience. You train for it, you do it once, and then you don't want to do it again because the water is so cold. And let's say you're skiing along and you're not sure if that sea ice is thick enough to hold your weight. So you actually hit the ice 3 times with your ski pole, and if it breaks through, then you know it won't support your weight, and you get dressed into your suit. You leopard crawl across the ice, the thin ice, you break it apart, move it out the way, and then your sledges will float along behind you, so you can pull them out the other side. And this we had to do probably about a dozen times. You can raft across small sections as well. You can jump from ice block to ice block and use the ice as a bit of a raft. And you can ski across small sections as well, being very careful that your skis don't snap, you know, if you put your weights right in the middle. So in this we were doing almost on a daily occurrence. So we talked a little bit about the temperature, but of course you've also got to not expose any bare skin. So, you know, any skin that's exposed at minus 40 with a slight breeze is going to start freezing very, very quickly. So everything has to be protected, and you never, ever, ever take your gloves off, you know, or your balaclava off. You know, you're always covered up. If you do, you're going to get frostbite. And the other way of getting frostbite is actually the opposite of that. If you're wearing all of your gloves and all of your clothing and you're skiing and you're getting really, really hot, then that being hot is not a good thing because you're then sweating, and that sweat goes into your clothing and then freezes, and then that clothing's no longer going to keep you warm. So you actually need to moderate your moisture levels. And so basically take layers off before you get too hot and put layers on before you get too cold, so you avoid getting frostbite. Of course, there are times when you might have to, well, you will have to go to the loo. So this is a photo just going to the loo. This was actually on Greenland, crossing Greenland. And you don't carry, and this is my preference, you don't carry a huge amount of toilet paper with you on an expedition, but there's lots of There's lots of ice, yeah, and chunks of ice make a really good triangle. You get 3 uses. I'll let you work out how that works. Don't go for a really hard lump of ice because you're going to have a bit of a shock, and don't go for a really soft lump of snow. So choosing your ice triangle to go to the loo is really important and a good skill to have. The reason why I'm showing you this, obviously a bit of a funny side to it, but even the most simplest of things that we take for granted here become a big challenge on the ice, especially mentally as well. You know you're going to get cold. So less than a minute, cover yourself back up inside the tent, and then you can sort yourself out a little bit better as well. So all we had to do was ski 10 miles a day, dragging our poles up and over the pressure ridges to get to the pole. Total journey was about 423 nautical miles. And we actually achieved that in 51 days. This is what the North Pole looks like, and we got there on Earth Day. I mean, that's really important to us at the time. We had our ups and downs. There were days when I found things extremely mentally challenging. I didn't know my two teammates very well, and that caused its own problems as well. I would like to say that we got on incredibly well, but we didn't always at times. We didn't always see eye to eye at times. But what we were able to do was to address those issues and to continue to function as a team. And we managed to achieve the North Pole. So life doesn't always go according to plan. And it's how we deal with that, and what we learn from that experience so that we can deal with things in a different way in the future as well, which is really, really key. That was my big take home from this expedition. So this is what happens when we reached the North Pole. Let's see if we can. So when I say 3 years of doing other expeditions and preparing to get to that point, I think that was a pretty powerful point in my life. And people always say that I'd heard the expression, it isn't the destination, it's the journey. At the time, I was so fixated about reaching the North Pole, I would have sworn blind that it was all about the destination. But over the past decade, I've learned so much about myself and so much about the world around me as well. And I think on this day on climate change, I was there actually collecting science samples for Plymouth University and understanding how that sea ice extends and retreats through a process of climatic modeling. So I was looking for algae that actually lived underneath the sea ice that then blooms into the water below. And that algae has a very unique chemical signature, which can be used in that modeling process. And I was delighted to come back with about 30 samples that helped go into some research papers that were produced on that. And I guess at the time, climate change was highly debated within the media. And as Professor Ian Stewart mentions in his talk, that there were a number of people who were speaking up for climate change, and there was almost an equal number that were speaking against it. And it's good to see now that through various outreach activities and I think public opinion has definitely swayed that climate change is in fact actually happening. And I've seen on other expeditions how glaciers have completely disappeared. I've seen how different species of wildlife have started to relocate because of changing climate. And I've certainly spoken to Indigenous people that live in the Arctic and heard their thoughts about how quickly the environment is changing. So as we sit at home working in isolation here at the moment, I think it's really important to really kind of look back and reflect on the past few years, the past decade for myself around this expedition, and to think, well, what would I like to see the world in the next 10 years? And I think we've got a real opportunity to see about how business, industry, education, how we engage with one another, and how that has had to change as a result of the lockdown. And so can we implement new ways of doing things which isn't so reliant on fossil-based fuels, for instance? Travel. Do we need to really travel as much as we do in our daily lives? I know that I've certainly cut back, and I think business will change as a result of that in the future. So I'm hoping that we've got an opportunity to really have an impact in how we interact with one another and how we interact with the environment as well. So I'm gonna stop my presentation there. I hope you've enjoyed my talk today. And using the Lightspeed platform, I hope you have some questions for me as well. So feel free to click on the forum where you'll be able to post questions, and myself, Ruth, and Ian, and other presenters will be able to help answer those questions for you. So thank you for watching. I look forward to interacting with you a little bit later on. Thank you.